Hey, welcome to 49cc Scoot. My name's Brent. I spent roughly a year prior to this video ruining pistons and cylinders after installing a 34mm Polini PWK in place of the 28mm Dell'Orto VHST that was on my 94cc Malossi RC1 two-stroke engine. Eventually I gave up and went back to the 28mm that worked fine after nothing that I did would stop the constant threat of piston failure using the PWK. There were two main reasons that led me to try the 34mm carb in the beginning. For one, multiple people told me that a 34mm PWK is a great carb for the RC1 and would make more horsepower and potentially improve acceleration and top speed. Top speed doesn't really concern me. I've had it up to 85 miles per hour before, but I've never even really tried for top speed. I do spend a lot of time on 8-mile acceleration runs though, so I would have been very happy to find gains there. I saw some potential for minor improvement at times, but never much change, and it didn't really matter anyway because it wouldn't stop destroying parts. The number one reason for me to switch carbs was that I wanted to build a 100cc flange mount engine someday, and some of those setups claim to require at least a 34mm carburetor, so I figured I could test it on a 94cc, and if it didn't work out then, I'd have it for a future project. Unfortunately, I didn't want to put that carburetor on any other engine after what I went through with it, and I didn't get any great results, so the big carb was quite a thorough failure. But that doesn't mean that I wanted to give up on the idea of going quicker with this scooter. When I first installed the new piston after the last failure with the PWK carburetor, I had what I call a conservative ignition timing curve in the CDI, which has 30 degrees of advance up to 7,000 RPM and then drops to 14.5 degrees by 13,500 RPM. It's not ultra safe, but it does have less timing than the MVT, MHR, or Stage 6 provided curves that I've used without causing the sluggish feeling that I got when I tried to use a flat 16-degree curve. With conservative timing, I averaged 9.85 at just over 66 miles per hour in the 8th mile, with a best pass being 9.75. My goal was to try to get to a 9.50, with my previous best single run being a 9.67 at 67.19 miles per hour. By the way, people tell me how slow I am very regularly, so it's important to bear in mind that I'm 300 pounds and 6'2" and don't tuck down much. So I'm heavy, which is huge in acceleration, and I punch a big hole in the air. Anyway, I thought that the easiest way to start improving times in my case would be to work on the launch, specifically 60-foot times. I began by loading a modified version of Malossi's MHR ignition curve back onto the CDI, thinking that having 4 degrees more advance at lower RPM would get me moving quicker. The current version of the curve does have less advance at high RPM, but I was trying to keep it mild in the power band after having so many problems with pistons for so long. Admittedly, a better test would have been to add just the low RPM timing and leave the rest alone. That way I could see specifically what I got from low RPM timing only. The Scoot felt noticeably more responsive. That made it even more surprising to me to see results showing that times went in the wrong direction. I went from 9.85 to 10.06 average. My 60-foot times told at least part of the story, with the average being a little bit slower than before. The more aggressive timing and snappier throttle response led me to take longer to get to full throttle because I wanted to make sure the front stayed down, and I think the rest of the time difference is likely due to changing advance in the power band. I decided to leave the timing alone for now and just focus on setting up the scooter for harder takeoffs. As is, it will get the front up on takeoff, but I don't like that and I'm not comfortable with it when I'm trying to do an acceleration run. So I try to avoid it by rolling into the throttle pretty quickly instead of snapping it open instantly. That does the trick and it'll keep the front on the ground, but it leaves room for inconsistency, and I've always felt like I was leaving time on the table by not getting into the throttle immediately. I'm not too proud to admit that probably the best way to fix this would be to let some air get under the front tire and ride it out the best I can. But I've rode this bike for a long time, and it's not something that I've ever been able to feel comfortable with, so it's probably not going to happen. To be honest, I could solve a whole lot of problems by simply letting a better and lighter rider do all of the racing for me. But I don't build this stuff to let someone else have all of the fun, so I needed to get the Scoot to work better for me. This scooter is practically a 4x4 with its 33-inch seat height, even though it's actually listed as 29 inches stock because of past suspension mods and now using 13-inch wheels. That's not a good thing when you want to launch hard, and why I suspect that it's a little more wheelie prone than some other scoots that I've seen or ridden. The lower you can get the center of gravity on a bike, the more it will resist doing wheelies. So of course, the higher the center of gravity, the more likely it is to wheelie. The easiest way for me to understand why this happens is to think about the distance from the rear tire's contact patch to the bike's center of gravity. To keep it simple, let's just assume that the center of gravity is right around the seat under the rider. Now think about the distance from the tire's contact patch to the center of gravity as a lever. The contact patch is the point where torque is applied, just like pushing on the end of a ratchet. Think of the center of gravity like a nut or a bolt that you're trying to remove at the opposite end of the ratchet. If I use this stubby little ratchet, there's no way that I can just push down on the end and loosen this lug nut. However, if I use a long ratchet or bar, it moves with a reasonable amount of force. Relating that back to the scooter, if the center of gravity is very near the contact patch, it would take a lot of force to rotate the bike and lift up the front, just like using a short ratchet. But if the center of gravity is far away from the contact patch, it creates a long lever, more similar to using a long ratchet on that lug nut, and it makes it easier to rotate the bike and lift the front end. If I can make this scooter lower, then it should resist wheelies a little bit better, and maybe that will let my candy ass launch this thing harder without the wheel coming up. I started at the rear because the rear sits higher than the front anyway, and lowering that only requires bolting on a shorter shock. I've found that keeping the rear a little higher than the front causes me to lean forward a bit more and put more weight on the handlebars on the front end, which gives it a more stable feeling at speed and for cornering, and improves traction for using the front brake. I'd like to maintain a little of that front to back angle, but keeping the front tire on the ground is my #1 goal. I removed the RDR shock that I was using, which measures 12¼ inches eye to eye. While I was making the change, I noticed that moving the rear of the bike up and down would shorten or stretch the wheelbase just slightly. It looked like if I dropped it all the way until there was contact with the rear fender, I could stretch it 3/8 inch or so from flattening out the engine. That's not much, since most people that stretch scooters usually seem to start at 2 or 3 inches. But even if I only got 1/8 or 1/4 inch from lowering, making the bike longer is also good for reducing wheelies. The only negative that I noticed is that lowering the rear makes my already bad carburetor mounting angle a little bit worse. I found a 9 3/4 inch MPA shock, 2.5 inches shorter than what I was using. Out of the box, it felt way too soft and sagged a lot with my weight, but that's pretty common for me on scooters. I wound up adjusting it to pretty much maximum preload, and it was still a little softer than I would have liked, with the coils nearly touching when I bounced the scooter. I took measurements at multiple points before I started this process, and then measured again every time I changed something so I could see exactly how height was affected. I also measured the angle of the top of the battery box so I could see how I changed the back to front lean. The frontmost measurement from ground to handlebar dropped by 1/2 inch, and the rearmost measurement to the plate on the back was 3.5 inches lower from a 2.5 inch shock change, with the seat height going down 1.5 inches. Back to front angle reduced from 7.5 degrees to 4.3 degrees, so the bike was sitting flatter. I did a few practice launches to get a feel for it, and it felt a little better, but not enough that I was going to try instant wide open throttle just yet. 60-foot times were reduced by basically 1/10, and that carried through to the 8th mile. The next step was to lower the front end by modifying the shocks. I'm not going to go into detail here because I have a video dedicated to the process of shortening the forks, but I made aluminum spacers and placed one on the damper rod of each shock as shown to drop the front 1.25 inches. It's customary to cut the fork springs, but I wanted the front to be stiff, so I left them alone and used the same spacers that I was already using to increase preload. The shock caps were not fun to install with the amount of pressure that it took to force them down while trying to work around other parts of the scooter. The handlebar dropped 1.25 inches, the seat height was another 5/8 of an inch lower, and the rearmost point came down 1/8 of an inch, while the back to front angle increased to 5.3 degrees, still more than 2 degrees less than before any lowering. It felt more stable taking off, but I still rolled into the throttle instead of trying to open it as quick as I could, and the results surprised me. 60 foots were essentially the same, with small improvements elsewhere, but I averaged 9.69 in the 8th mile, with 2 back-to-back 965s, which were my quickest runs to date. To suddenly almost average my best previous single time was impressive, but I'm still not sure why the gains seemed to happen on the top end, unless being a little bit lower helped with aero more than I would think it should. Whatever the case, I liked the rear stance, aside from the rear shock that was too soft, so I picked up a 275mm Moto Force Eco shock from ScooterTuning.ca. It's the same length as the MDA shock, but I could adjust it to be stiffer so the ride was better for me. Looking for parts for your scooter? Check out ScooterTuning.ca. Whether you're working on a 50cc or a 500cc, they've got performance parts for your stock engine. They've got entire racing engines. How about some brake upgrades? Maybe some new fairings? You can find high-quality parts with fast, affordable shipping from ScooterTuning.ca. They help to support this channel and other creators, so please support people that support the scooter community and shop at ScooterTuning.ca. I finally decided that I was going to try full throttle launches with dreams of 2.0 60 foots and 9/58. The front would actually stay down, so I started doing a bunch of passes thinking I was breaking my personal bests, until I checked the dragy. It was actually going slower. On previous runs rolling into the throttle quickly, I averaged 2.19 60 foots, but trying to get to wide open throttle in a snap, I averaged 2.29. I can't say that I felt anything wrong, but logic would tell me that most likely I either had carb tuning issues causing it not to respond as it should with abrupt throttle opening, or I had clutch or belt slip when trying to apply power with greater immediacy. I adjusted the idle mixture and nothing changed, so I went to a spot with a small hill to try a few launches. My thought was that going uphill would increase stress on everything and it would decrease going downhill. So if there was any clutch or belt slip, I might notice it more uphill and less downhill. That idea actually worked better than I expected, so much so that I thought I spun the tire once when taking off uphill. I don't really think it spun the tire because I've done good 60 foots while it was starting to rain, so it would probably take a lot for traction to be an issue for me. Downhill, it felt fine. I took apart the CVT and didn't find anything alarming, but there was a little polished area near the center of the variator and the outer edge of the rear pulley. The clutch and bell had minor glazing, but that's pretty normal. I cleaned everything and went over the drive faces with a Scotch-Brite pad to give them a very mild texture so nothing was still polished smooth. The clutch and bell were sanded with an emery cloth. The Stage 6 MK2 clutch uses removable weights that can change how it engages, with more weight helping it slip less when it grabs, so I added one more weight to each shoe. Adding weight can decrease engagement RPM, so I also adjusted the spring tension just a little bit tighter. I suspected that belt slip was probably a more serious issue, so I replaced a Polini 28 kg contra spring with a 36 kg spring to put more pressure on the belt. Using a stiffer contra spring will increase RPM if all else is left the same. So I swapped 5.5 gram sliders out for 6.25 gram sliders to keep RPM about where it was. The changes brought my 60 foot down, but I didn't get the big payoff that I hoped for. I had one really good run of a 946 at 68.68 with a 6.460 to 60, which were both new bests. But a tailwind definitely kicked up on that run, and overall a bunch of passes averaged 9.75. The CVT probably needed more fine-tuning, but it ran well enough that I moved on to trying to find better results through ignition timing. My primary focus for starting out was to change timing where the engine spends most of its time during acceleration, which is usually about 13,300 RPM to 14,000 RPM for good results. I expected gains or losses from small changes to be fairly small, so I made up a few variations of my already modified version of the MHR curves before I did any testing. That way I could try them all back to back more quickly, so conditions were less likely to change much and skew results. I had the modified MHR curve with 16 degrees of advance at 13,300 RPM and 14.2 degrees at 14,000 RPM. I tend to get my best results around 13,500 RPM, and this gave me 15 degrees of advance there. The next curve changed only the 13,300 RPM timing point to 17 degrees, which bumped it up to about 15.75 degrees at 13,500. Then I made a curve that advanced 14,000 degrees one more degree to 14.2, which put it at 16 degrees at 13,500 RPM. And one last curve changed timing at 14,000 RPM to 12.2 degrees for 15.5 degrees of advance at 13,500 RPM. It may be simpler to put a timing point at 13,500 RPM and only change that, but I was also trying to get some idea of what it may like across the range, and honestly, you could spend tons of time making small changes and retesting, and I just didn't have unlimited time. I tried every curve, and there was barely a change in results, with only 7/100ths of a second in the 8th mile separating the best and the worst times. I went with the first modified curve that had timing at 15 3/4 degrees at 13,500 RPM because it was the quickest average for 8th mile and 0 to 60. RPM was up a little more than I liked, so I went back up a 1/4 gram with roller weight, but I still didn't see much benefit and it only matched its previous 8th mile average with the same curve. Next, I decided to remove the 380 gram weight disc on the flywheel to see if I could get RPM up a little more quickly off the line and hopefully improve runs by starting out with a strong 60 foot. I talked to a guy named Zach Gillette a lot who does some really quick times on his scooter, and he says that flywheel weight always slows him down, so I thought it may be worth having a harder time getting the engine to kickstart, at least when I'd be racing. Guess we're gonna find out right now. Once again, we're back to it not turning over quickly enough when you don't have all that weight on there. So you gotta kick the crap out of it. Well, at least it illustrates how much of a difference it makes, because this is normally not that hard. It dropped between 200 and 700 RPM on average during acceleration, which was the opposite of what I thought would happen. Even with RPM lower than I'd like, times did improve a little bit. I was worried that something else had gone wrong coincidentally at the same time that I removed the weight disc, so I reinstalled it and RPM came back up and I lost most of the gains. Okay, so there's definitely a correlation between weight or mass of the crankshaft and anything attached to it, and the roller weight required, with seemingly more crank weight requiring less roller weight. I've switched ignitions before, and I've even lightened stock flywheels, But I never picked up on this because I guess most of the time I was changing more than just weight and not changing weight this much. I took the disc back off and used lighter sliders to put RPM where I found the best results before, but it actually went slower than it did with lower RPM. There was a long period of time where it was windy every day, and I think that could have been changing my results a little bit, even with me testing back-to-back in opposite directions to try to negate outside influence. But regardless of that, I wasn't seeing enough of a change to make it worth being hard to start without the rotor weight, so I reinstalled it. It was an interesting experiment at least. I also learned that it seemed like it needed the weight to carry momentum off the line. Data shows that RPM drops off more after launch with less flywheel weight. So I think what happens is that the clutch flashes RPM up on takeoff, and the heavy flywheel basically stores some of that energy and helps to carry RPM through lower speeds. I see more of a dip in RPM with less flywheel weight. Zach seemed to view reducing flywheel weight as purely a positive for his setup, but he also makes a lot of power with a way lighter scooter and rider, so I suspect that it doesn't need as much help with momentum as I do. At this point, I had a race in 2 days and not much time to work on the scoot, so I made a couple of changes at once. I replaced the 36 kilogram Polini Contra spring with a 32 kilogram version, thinking that was probably enough of a change from the 28 kilogram that I was using for a while to keep the belt from slipping without applying more pressure than I need, which can have negative effects. I also tightened the clutch springs up a little bit more for later engagement. "60-foot times improved slightly compared to prior runs, but otherwise I didn't see much change. My last attempt before the race was making my own drag racing curve, not to be confused with the one that Stage 6 provides with their ignition. My drag curve was basically just the modified MHR curve that worked best for me, with more advance below 7,000 RPM that I hoped would push it through the initial throttle hit and ramp RPM up more quickly to improve 60 foots. That worked as I hoped, and I saw better times across the board. There was a tailwind on one direction of my runs, and it made the best pass I've ever done, which was a 933 at 69 miles per hour, but also the quickest time starting at the 60 foot all the way through. I was dreaming of seeing a 950 one day when I started, and now it averaged a 953 and broke into the 930s. Yeah, I know, I had a tailwind on one pass, and average times are what I go by for testing. But if you make a record pass at a track and the wind is in your favor, as far as I know, that's still a record, so I was happy about it anyway. I raced it just like that and ran 950s and 960s on the track, where I think the sticky surface actually slowed me down, especially off the line where I ran 2.2 and slower 60 foots. I had been feeling what I believed to be the rear brake dragging since just before the no prep race, and I replaced the entire rear caliper assembly prior to the race, but it still felt like something was creating resistance on the rear wheel at times. Eventually, I found that my homemade torsion arm was sitting off-center over the axle. The steel tube torsion arm feels pretty stiff to me, but I think I just found out the hard way that due to material properties, there's a good reason that all of the aftermarket torsion arms are machined from billet aluminum. That makes all of the time and money that I put into making the torsion arm kind of a waste, aside from being yet another learning experience. There was a 15 mile per hour wind with 20 to 30 mile per hour gusts, so I tightened the clutch springs up just a little bit more and went out and did 4 runs trying to keep the wind at my back. All 4 runs were in the 930s, with the best being a 9.3 at 70.82 miles per hour, plus new bests everywhere from 50 miles per hour and beyond. 60 foots and 0 to 30 and 0 to 40s didn't quite get where I'd hoped, but I'm sure many of you know that CVT tunes can be quite finicky, and even small changes to belt width or wear can throw you off from your best numbers. Some hardcore racers may only get 1 to 10 passes out of a belt before times fall off. I know that my times aren't impressive for what my setup is, but I'm still very happy to go from averages in the 980s to averages in the 950s, and a best of 967 to a best of 930. Again, yes, I had a tailwind, and I think my true best on a calm day is in the 940 range, but I only hope to see a 950 some way, somehow when I started out. I also think this bike should do 8-second eighth miles with a rider that's not 300 pounds, and I will get one on there with a dragy hopefully before long. If you've enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a like and leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of my future content, and you'll get to see if I make this scooter even faster. As always, thank you for watching.